everyone, and welcome to the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Kristen Eccleston, aka the Neurodiverse Teacher. And before I introduce my first guest, I just want to let my listening audience know that today we will be talking about some intense topics related to sexual violence, just in case any of these topics may be a trigger for you. But let's go ahead and get started. Today, my guest is Robert Uttaro. Robert is currently in his 15th year as a rape crisis counselor and community educator. Inspired by his undergraduate studies in criminal justice, he continues to embrace a lifelong commitment to activism and advocacy for survivors of sexual violence. Serving as a counselor, Uttaro supports rape survivors and their significant others through mental, emotional, spiritual, and legal issues. He also facilitates workshops that unpack the realities of sexual violence and offers strategies for support and prevention with a focus on healing. Uttaro has been featured in magazine publications across the country and on international radio broadcasts. Uttaro is the author of the book To the Survivors, which continues to impact people's minds and hearts globally. Well, welcome, Robert. I'm very excited to have you on the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, let's go ahead and jump right into things. I really want to know your journey to becoming a rape crisis counselor and how you knew that this was ultimately the path that you wanted to take.
hmm Yeah, I just want to thank you again, and just to tell your listeners, one more time that if this is really tough for you to, turn the podcast off or maybe come back to another time, please take care of yourself during this interview and after. So do whatever it is that brings you peace, whatever that might be. So yeah, I was a college senior. I was a senior in college taking a class called Women in Crime, and it was talking about looking at female gang members, women incarcerated in prison, and there was a whole class. There was a part of the class that dealt with the issue of rape, and we were reading a book. It was just hitting me very deeply. Things were happening inside of me, and then there was one day that three women from a local crisis center came and spoke to our class, and I couldn't wait to be there. I was really interested in what they had to say. And these three women walked in and they started talking, and they were like angels to me. They were so strong and so gentle, and I was just in awe of like that these women do this on a full-time basis. And it's like, how do you do this, so they talked what they did, and then they showed us a reenactment of a perpetrator. So they showed us a 6-minute reenactment of a perpetrator, and a deep rage came in me that actually scared me. I was just crazy, and then that rage turned into like a deep disgust. So I really thought I was going to throw up in my chair, and I really felt God working in me. And there were opportunities to volunteer after class, and I was so nervous, so scared. Um, but God said to me, "Will you help?" And I just went up to the women after, terrified, and I just said, "Oh, can I volunteer with you?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we'll take your information down." They took my information down, and then I ended up beating some people out for an internship. So they
Mhm.
selected me, and then my life's never been the same. So I've been doing it ever
Wow.
since.
Wow, that's there's so much to unpack there. I mean, the fact that you just felt so passionate. Now, let me ask, was there any kind of personal reasoning or something that, a loved one or something, or this is a topic that as you were learning more about it, you just felt like, no, I feel called, I feel compelled. This is what I need to be doing.
That's exactly it. There was something deeper, nothing of personal experience, nothing of family members. I wasn't thinking about, family or friends or anyone.
Mhm.
It was just seeing this evil in the world
Yeah.
and being called to do something. And that could have been as simple as, listening to someone. That could be as simple as cleaning the toilets in the office. That could be as simple as making copies. Whatever they wanted me to do, I would have done.
Yeah.
And I knew I've learned a lot, doing the work and through their trainings and through the book. And um, I learned how horrible it is when people blame rape survivors for being assaulted. And I just knew that I would never do that. So I knew
Mhm.
that I continue to see the power in just listening to someone. So I knew that I would listen. I knew that I would not blame. And if that was effective, then I would love to do that. And if they accepted me, then I would do the best I could. And they did. And like I said, I've just been doing it ever since. I'll do it as long as I'm effective at it, if I am.
Wow. So tell me, how has this evolved over time then? So you were in a class, you had this opportunity, you started volunteering. Is this what you do full time, or is this still a voluntary basis?
It's work full time, but it's not a 40-hour job, if that makes sense. Meaning things can happen to me. I just had an incident at a concert the other night at probably 10:30 at night where I was helping a guy out who was triggered. So in that sense, the work is always, but it's not, an 8 to 4, 9 to 5 job. It
Mhm.
doesn't pay my bills. But it's evolved. I first did it and I was working in case management, so we were working in helping people kind of deal with finances, usually housing. A lot of survivors do know that perpetrators, certain times they have to get away from them. So trying to
Mhm.
find people housing, but it's always counseling no matter what if you're working with people. But as a story I tell in my book, but actually, the first time I was allowed to sit on a call, right? And
Mhm.
the woman who I worked with said to a woman she was speaking with, she said, "Do you feel comfortable with a man listening to this conversation?" And that really hit me because I was like, I'm not even speaking to this person. But because it's so sensitive and painful, she still had to even ask that. And that was something that always changed me and something I'll never forget. So it's evolved in that way. Then you get involved in more calls, right? You get involved in more
Mhm.
people, deal with some legal issues. I remember multiple times, but I've heard men be more devastated and distraught than their female partners, their girlfriends, wives. They're crushed after learning what happened to them.
Mhm.
Um, and then I took a break, and then I always thought my voice was terrible, and people was like, "Oh, you should join a community group. You should teach." I'm like, "No way, that's awful. Listen to me." And then, but I did. I ultimately joined a community group, and I would go around giving trainings, teaching
Mhm.
people about these issues, and then in that, people get triggered. So you're still
Mhm.
doing counseling in those engagements, schools, high schools, colleges, community events, and then over time, I ended up writing a book, and now I spend a lot of my time trying to spread my book and these messages globally to the best of my ability. So it's evolved in many ways, but the work is always the same, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, I do my next question is not about the book, but I am it's kinda like my
Mm,
next question because I do wanna hear about that, but I wanted to ask you something because it came up a couple of times where you're talking, and it triggered this thought in my mind. I think, when a lot of people hear rape, I think a lot of people automatically assume or think females. But how much of your
mhm,
work do you also find that males are impacted? Maybe not just so much as their partner, because it sounds like you deal with that too, but men
mhm.
who have actually been raped and what that means for them and how much does that come up in your work?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of people who are affected are female, are women.
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean, men are not assaulted. Men and little boys are being sexually abused every day. There are men who are against significant others who are absolutely devastated by learning about their wives or their kids. There are other men that don't care at all, that they don't even, I know women that would never tell their husbands because they're so, yeah, they're just not really that kind to them.
Mhm.
Um, and there are men who commit crimes, right? So there's really a whole range of how it affects. So yes, I deal with that often. There was one time I was at an event for male rape survivors, and
Mhm.
it was the women who were bawling. They were like wives of these guys, and I just got the sense they just recently learned about their sexual abuse, gushing tears. So you can imagine if you're married to someone for say 20 years and never knew of this, and then it comes out. So yes, I deal with that plenty of times, but mostly it is women. But we should not think of our men and our boys and our transgender people, people of all backgrounds, all identities, to think it can happen to anyone.
And I'm glad you brought that up. I know we were kind of chatting before we started jumping into things, and I mentioned to you that I worked at a high school for many, many years, and it was for students significantly with mental health needs. And I had quite a significant population of transgender students come through. And I found that there was a correlation that many, and again, this is not mutually exclusive, so I don't want my
Mhm,
listeners to assume that I'm saying that it is, because it is not. But I just, in this particular circumstance, I found that many of my transgender students had been victims, and I would say even prior to their going through their transition, victims of sexual assault. And so that many of them had dealt with sexual traumas prior to them coming to the realization that they did want to transition. And I wasn't sure if that was something that you had come across, because oftentimes I find that because I was in a situation where I was dealing with mental health, I had very, I don't want to say biased situations, but you were only coming to me if you were dealing with things. And so I only saw populations of people who are already dealing with mental health. So that's not to say that that is what's going on, but I'm curious in your work if that's something that you often come across, that people who are transgender are dealing with a higher rate maybe of sexual assaults.
Hmm. I mean, I know it's the least reported violent crime in the world. So it's a
Mhm,
crime hidden in secrecy and shame so
mhm,
often. And so we really don't know what people are going through in our lives unless we do,
true,
right? And
mhm,
so I couldn't speak to rates because I don't know, any numbers we have ultimately don't tell the full story, but I can
yeah,
relate to what you're saying. And I do know of some transgender people who've been sexually abused, and then I know other transgender people who have not been that I'm aware of, or they just haven't been.
mhm,
But I can tell you that I do know some people that genuinely don't feel comfortable wearing a dress or a skirt, and it's tied to safety for them.
mhm,
At least in these people, so a dress and a skirt is unsafe. Just as one example. And then you say, well, why? And well, they were sexually abused and they were raped even while wearing one. So
mhm,
the effect that can have on them is so deep, and how it can possibly play a role in transitioning in terms of gender identity or identity. People are struggling in many different ways. And I would also say to you specifically that they came to you for a reason, that they
yeah,
open up to you for a reason, that even though you're working in mental health, that doesn't mean they have to talk to you. That doesn't mean they have to disclose to you. So that means you're pretty special because you have this welcoming environment where they trust you and feel comfortable enough sharing that information with you because they don't have to.
that's very kind of you to say, and that's it's a good way to look at things too, and I mean, that was always what I was striving for with all of my students,
Hmm.
no matter what they were going through, is that they felt like there was a safe space. But it definitely was something that I had noticed, and I definitely took note of. And then I've had students before too who I had taught prior to them transitioning, and now that I know them later in life, they have transitioned, and they had not necessarily had sexual assaults happen to them prior to their transitioning, but now they have kind of expressed to me that there is almost like this boundary that some people think that it's like an open door for people to sexually assault them because of this transition. And I wasn't
Hmm.
sure if maybe that was something you had come across too, where you have people reporting now that there's almost like this boundary issue that some people have, that they think there's like this open door
Hmm.
because this person has transitioned. And I don't know how to best explain it. So hopefully I am explaining it correctly, but it's like, because I now identify
Hmm.
this gives you the right to violate me, which it doesn't, but it's like some
Hmm.
people see it that way.
Yeah, I personally don't see that as much, but it's an interesting insight, and I wonder if that's happening more in society as more people feel comfortable coming out, as more
Mhm.
people transition into different identities. Um, and I also wonder who is committing the perpetration, right? Is it people within the trans community who are committing these crimes against transgender people, or is it people who are not trans and maybe see someone that they think is weak or more likely, and they choose to assault? Because we do know that many people sadly do prey upon weaker people. That doesn't mean transgender people are weak. I'm just saying that if someone sees it that way, and they then
Perception.
yeah, and they feel more uh, apt to assault, or to make not just sexual assault, but to possibly bully or to just hurt in general. So I
And
think
from what I
that's
understand,
something we might find more over time.
and what I understand from my students, friends who are transgender, that it's the latter, that it's like it's not people within the community, it's people
Mm,
who are essentially taking advantage, or think, again, we're not saying weaker, but they're this perception that they have that
mhm,
it's my right, I can take advantage because I'm not seeing you as an equal, essentially. So
mhm,
or it doesn't count. And sometimes I wonder if it's people who maybe sexually curious themselves, but they
mhm,
don't have proper boundaries. And so they think that this is a way that they can explore things in a way of taking advantage of another person, but then it doesn't really and I'm air quoting for those people who are listening, but doesn't count type of thing, which
Mhm.
again is not true, but I think it's kind of the sick psychological aspect that some people take.
Sure, and it's interesting because, rape is more about power and control than sex. And,
Mhm.
people have sexual desire, sexual fantasies, sexual identities, and that is what it is, but that doesn't mean you have to then go hurt someone,
Right.
right? So there's you can explore sexuality, you can be confused about sexuality, there are many different ways to get these questions out and get these feelings out without, as you said, taking advantage of someone. At the end of the day, regardless of how one identifies or one's experiences, does not give you the right to take advantage of anyone, and especially in a sexual way, when in reality, this is causing deep destruction and pain to countless people throughout this world. Um, so we got to look at the motives of why people do it and what's happening. So again, to your point, if someone is struggling, they got to find a different way to figure that out without hurting someone.
100%. 100%. Now, you've written a book called To the Survivors. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? What was your inspiration for writing it?
The inspiration came from a dream. I woke up and I said, I have to write a book, and I did. And it's a combination of my journey becoming a rape crisis counselor with
Mhm.
true stories of women and men and one transgendered man. So back to our conversation earlier when you asked about men, there's one story of one transgender man and three stories of men who were all sexually abused as children. So
Oh,
there is written poetry, written stories, and interviews. These people came and interviewed with me, and it's
mhm,
all raw. It's all word for word. So it deals with many different issues. Huge focus on sexual abuse, but not just sexual abuse. Um, you know, Depression, healing, family, schools, crime, spirituality, God. It kind of touches upon a lot of issues like justice and injustice. So one doesn't have to be sexually abused to hopefully benefit from it. I hope that it became a universal book, so even just a human being could maybe gain even just one insight from it. That'd be a gift to me. So.
wow, that's amazing. And that sounds like something that if anybody has been impacted by this topic would really be empowering to read because you can I always feel like there's this concept of feeling alone, especially when you're going through traumatic things and this really sounds like a way to kind of get an insight to feel that you're not alone, that there are people out there who understand and have gone through similar experiences.
It is. There's a range of it, meaning there are people who read it and love it and
Mhm.
connect with it, and there's also people that want nothing to do with it, and that's
Hmm.
totally okay. I never would ask anyone to read that book if they were not ready. I
Mhm.
think it's important to people know it exists, but there are people that want nothing to do with it, or maybe they will in 10 years, but
Mhm.
they don't, right now. So there's a range. That's an important thing for people to understand of healing and regaining power and control to do things for yourself that is really healthy for yourself in certain time periods when you're ready. So if someone is ready and they want to read a page, awesome. If they don't, that's okay. And a book is important because you can read it at 2 a.m. when you're having nightmares, you can't sleep, and maybe that's
Mhm.
helpful for you. You can call a counselor. Obviously, you can call a hotline, but there's something special, hopefully, too, about a book in the privacy of your own home, if you choose. So yeah, there's a range of reactions to it, which
Mhm.
is pretty powerful, actually.
Wow. That's I hope that if anybody is listening who has been through this experience, that they're willing to check it out. And as you said, maybe it's a page, maybe it's the whole book, maybe it's when you're ready, but that there's a resource out there and stories that you can connect to through other people who've also had similar experiences. Now, let me ask you this. How much do you find that there are people who have been through traumatic experiences that maybe it was when they were younger and
Mm.
maybe now that they're adults, they're starting to feel the experiences or the triggers or now starting to cope with it versus people who it's recently happened? Or do you find that you get a pretty good mixed bag of unfortunately both happening or I'm just kind of curious as what is the range of people who are dealing with traumas from when they were younger versus recent traumas?
I would say more than we think. more than we know. I would say, way too many children are sexually abused, and they don't say
Mm,
anything
mhm.
for justified reasons. It's very difficult for a kid to speak about that, let
Yeah,
alone if they were abused by someone they know,
yeah,
whether it was a family member, a teacher, a friend's father or mother, right? Women commit sexual crimes as well.
mhm,
Um, so it's really difficult. And then you can see it coming out in life as teens, but as adults, even older adults. So yeah, there were many people, many adults who sadly were abused as kids. And then once it comes out a little bit and the healing process kind of begins, and you can really oftentimes make connections to people's choices, people's lives, whether it's into their like relationships, whether it could be into addiction, whether it could be into eating, to depression. There is a connection of sexual abuse to a lot of our mental health issues and to a lot of our addiction problems. Doesn't mean for all, I'm not saying that, but huge connection. So yeah, and it doesn't just go away. It's not like, the men in my book as an example, and I'm sorry to keep talking about my book, but those are three examples of guys that didn't just stop and go away,
yeah,
right? I mean, this is
yeah,
well into their life that they started dealing with it. And they've suffered immensely because of it, just like countless women and countless transgendered people do, non-binary people all over this world. So it has a huge effect. And yes, there's I couldn't give a number to you, but there's many times you see someone or you know someone, maybe you work
mhm,
someone, whatever it is, for years, and you just say, hey, and then out of nowhere you're like, wait, hold on, what happened to you? What
yeah,
happened to you when you were 7? What happened to you when you were 11? And oftentimes they'll belittle it. It's like, no, 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 this is huge. This is actually life changing.
yeah. Now, do you think the people, when they belittle it, do you think it's because it's a coping mechanism or maybe not wanting to come to the realization of how significant it is?
I think that and other things. I think people so many people it's beyond insecure. It's like having like no self-esteem, right?
Yeah,
There's like low self-esteem and feeling completely worthless, feeling, just loaded, shrouded with shame, where someone thinks they don't exist, they don't matter, they're so meaningless. So that's part of the belittling as well. It's like, oh, or they might have just thought it was normal, right? Oh, I just thought that's normal.
yeah,
That's just what happens to me. That's just what happens to my family. That's just what happens to girls. And it's like, no, this is a crime. This is a horrific act that has deep destruction to you.
and, I wondered that. I wonder if so many reasons why adults later or after the fact realize this happened to me is because when you're a kid, you don't know, right? You don't
Mhm,
know how things work. You assume if this is an adult that you trust or you love or cares about you, that they wouldn't do anything bad to you. And I think sometimes it's not until you have this realization as an adult that all of a sudden you go, wait, that's not normal. That's not how it's
mhm.
supposed to be. That's wrong. That's bad. And then it's like having to unpack years and years and years of things that you thought were normal or you thought were okay or you thought that's just the way things were.
Yeah, and that's all the more reason to tell people what you said earlier is that you're not alone. So there are reasons, there are different reasons why people come forward and reasons why people don't come forward. And sometimes there are people who know it happened to them and they just don't talk about it and they get on with their life and they maybe really immerse themselves in could be athletics or a career and they're super successful in the way the world says success.
Mhm,
But deeply they're suffering that finally something breaks. Or sometimes people genuinely don't know that it happened. They repressed it. They blocked it out so much.
mhm,
And they might be triggered. Could be being touched, could be a song, could be a person, a news article, could be any one of those things or others. And then they just snap. So
mhm,
um, if and when that happens, or when people feel comfortable getting it out, to know that they're not alone, to know that there are people out there that will really listen to them, to be with them, to sit with them. And there really are options out there. That doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it just happens like that because it doesn't. But it's terrifying to speak about it. So that's a huge reason why people don't, because they also can fear what comes after. But
mhm.
that doesn't mean they should stay silent because as scary as it difficult as it is, ultimately getting something out will be beneficial in their lives in the long run. even though it's incredibly difficult. Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And my next question for you is, if somebody is realizing or coming to that realization that, hey, this has happened to me, um, what should they do? Like, if I'm sitting here and I'm realizing, oh my gosh, I've been through this, I'm, the triggers are finally happening. I'm coming to these realizations. What are my next steps? What do I do? Where do I go to seek help and support? Because I sometimes think that that's also a concern, that people have these realizations, but they don't know where to go with it.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because people are different and
Mhm,
people need different things at different times. I People often ask me, "What do you say to people?" I'm like, "No, no, no. I listen more than I speak. We need
mhm,
to listen more than we speak." So, however, I will say if someone wants to say something to someone, that they have to find someone that they really love and trust that will take care of them. Now, that can be a friend, right? That can be a
mhm,
sibling. That can be a priest. That can be a counselor, right? That can be a teacher.
mhm,
So to do that to someone that will really treat them well. Now, you could also go to all of those and they could still treat you poorly, right?
mhm,
So not everyone is equipped to handle this. So I think that's vitally important to someone that will treat them well, that will believe them, that will listen to them and sit with them. And then maybe, depending on what the needs are, we go to different avenues, right? Maybe,
mhm,
do you need to go to a hospital do you want to get a kit done? Do you want to get an exam done? Do you want to call the police? Do you really just want to stay in and watch movies all night? You know, really seeing where that goes. But yes, there are, whether it's family, friends, or strangers, there are online blogs, resources. RAIN is a national network in America
mhm,
that people can contact, a statewide issue. So just knowing that things are out there is just huge. But also, the first person someone tells is it's vitally important, and the person who receives it is vitally important. So we essentially have a very strong responsibility to send people down a path of healing or a path of destruction solely on how we respond. And too many of us are not responding adequately.
mhm. And what do you think that is? Because I find that with mental health in general too, trying to just make a kind of a parallel example here, that oftentimes people don't understand what it is or what it looks like or what it feels like. And so that response is similar. What do you think is that blockade of people's response, and what could people do if they genuinely want to know more, or they
Mm.
want to be able to respond? Is there a place they can go and to get more information or to learn how to be a better responder?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's again, depending on where you live, there are local right crisis centers. People can volunteer if that's something people are called to do. I've never asked anyone to do what I do,
Mhm,
but if someone's called to it, go for it. Know that you have the gifts. You know there are options out there. You can make a difference. You really can, if that's something you desire. To check out your local crisis center or look at a national network, or even maybe getting involved in your school. Maybe it's creating an event. Maybe it's again an event in maybe a religious setting, or even as small as just talking with your family. Like you're talking about with your work with students, even just in families, to be able to
mhm,
have a welcome environment where our kids can just talk to us. Let them ask the questions. It might not be as intense as like full on rape or assault, but even, having them feel comfortable talking about a video they saw or a comment they heard or something someone else experienced. And when we don't do that as parents and as adults, the kids most often keep it inside, or they have to go to maybe other kids or our ridiculous society that has foolish messages out there. So I think it's
mhm,
important. There's many, many different things we can do um, to really make a real difference, a real genuine difference. And it's so much. I don't talk to people about going to get criminal convictions. It's more about your life, your safety, your healing, and what do you really need at the time to kind of live in life with this horrible thing that happened to you. Did that answer your
mhm.
question?
No, it did. That definitely answered my question. And then kind of the second part I have it is, why do you think there is a little bit of this disconnect of people not
Mm,
being able to respond well when somebody comes to them? Do you think it's just a lack of knowledge? Do you think it's a shock of, like, I'm not sure what to say? Um
right. That was your first part of the question. Many different reasons. We both work in schools, right? Look how unkind we see kids can be to each other.
Yeah.
Look how ridiculous we can see adults be to each other, even in a school setting.
Yeah.
And so we as human beings aren't often, or maybe not always, being the kindest, the most respectful, the most compassionate, the most
Mhm.
empathetic to each other. There's again a range of reasons, and so why are some people not responding adequately? Well, some people genuinely don't know how to, but that's okay because you can say, "I don't know, but I can send you somewhere," right?
Yeah.
No one's asking anyone to become a lawyer, a counselor, a cop, a nurse, right? But we
Mhm.
can send you there if that's where you really need to go. So some people genuinely don't know. Some people don't even believe it. So when someone comes to you and says something, no, 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 no. There's no way that happened, or there's no way that person would do that to you.
Mhm.
Um, some people are simply in denial of their own crimes. So some people can control people immensely so, and so they're not going to respond well if you even talk to them when they're the ones controlling you in the first place, right? If they're the ones abusing you in the first place. And some people genuinely, it hurts. It's actually it's very heavy. It's very difficult for people to do. So there's many people that just they're like, I don't know what to do with this information. And other people might actually be suffering themselves and they can blame themselves. I know many stories of plenty of people who um, respond horrendously. I can think of one person specifically who was a man became a Christian pastor and who he is treating a woman horrendously by being raped because she was in his bedroom. Now, this was a woman who was dating her boyfriend, and why is she wrong to be in in a bedroom with her boyfriend as
Mhm.
grown adults? They could be watching a movie. Now, he could also
Mhm.
assault her in the kitchen. He could assault her at the beach. He could do that anywhere. So why? So he's making her feel even worse about himself. But the truth is, he also has his own trauma that he hasn't dealt with himself. So I
Mhm.
wonder if he's also um, not dealing with himself in his own denial of his own pain and reacting this way.
Deflecting it. Yep.
Yeah.
Do you come across that a lot? I mean, that's a topic that you hear a lot with rape victims, that you hear the assaulter being like, "Well, they shouldn't have been dressed that way," or "They shouldn't have been here." And it's really like trying to put the blame on the victim for your actions, and I'm assuming you probably come across that quite a bit.
I do. It's not even perpetrators per se. I mean, there's also, like I said, even in schools. Like
Mhm.
when I worked with students in high schools, that we do trainings, and I love working with the kids, right? I really am interested in what do they want to get out in this training, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes it's about consent laws, and sometimes it's about again responding and talking about what you're saying. Like, why are you blaming someone for the clothes they wear for being raped? And
Yeah.
then, like, if I got a fresh haircut and you like it, that doesn't mean someone will rape me. If I'm wearing a certain kind of shirt, are you going to assault me? And people laugh because it's laughable. It's so ludicrous for me to say, "Oh, well, look at me today and I have a suit on." So that's crazy. So
Yeah.
why do you not say that if a woman's in a dress or a bathing suit? That doesn't mean you have the right to assault her.
Mhm.
So some people it makes them feel even safer. Some people feel like, well, if I don't do that, this won't happen to me.
Mhm.
But that's not reality. And people bring in alcohol a lot, and even in my students in high school, we talk about alcohol. But in my experience, in my 15 years of doing this, the overwhelming vast majority of people who I've worked with, alcohol had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing to do with it. So say someone goes to a party at night, they get hammered drunk, they have a blast, they go home, they're not assaulted. But the next morning they're assaulted by a family member or a friend. Would you blame them? Why would you blame them? No.
Yeah.
So there's a range of reasons why the blame comes, but all of it's really not okay. We just simply should not be blaming people, even if they make choices that we disagree with, even if they make choices we might judge. That still does not give someone the right to do that. And again, the effects are so long; they're so deep and long lasting, and our blame is making it worse. Right? Again, how we respond to it plays a big role. If we're compassionate, empathetic, listening, present with people, this actually can save lives. when we start not believing and judging and blaming and even being mean to them or criticizing them, uh, it causes just immense pain on top of immense pain.
That's tough. So tell me, you mentioned now that you do a lot of trainings at the high school level. I'm really interested as somebody who was a high school teacher for so many years, and really this podcast was meant to be a voice for youth and young adults. What does that training look like at the high school level? What is it that you help high schoolers understand about this topic?
It depends. It depends on the needs of the people I'm speaking with at the time, right? I've seen
Mhm,
kids do amazing presentations on human trafficking, and
mhm,
I've seen kids, it was like deeply moving. And I've seen kids, like I said, really want to talk about what consent means. I have,
mhm.
even consent, like you're seniors in high school and you still don't understand consent is more than just verbally. Okay, that's a huge piece of this. Um,
Can you
and
go into that? Because I feel like that's a topic that should really be heard.
yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many people I know that to this day, many years after being raped, will blame themselves because they ultimately uttered the word yes. Well, they uttered the word yes after many no's, but that were ignored and denied. And then it's more, and then you're being grabbed, and there's all this fear. And so ultimately say
Mhm,
yes to just get out of it.
mm,
It's more than verbally. So you can say yes verbally, but you really don't mean it. You can say yes verbally and mean it. But there's also body language. To me, we communicate in many different ways. So you have
mhm,
verbal, right? You have body language. So someone say yes, but what is their body telling them? This is one thing I'll say in high schools. So if someone says yes, but they can't even walk because
mhm,
they're so drunk,
mhm.
what's their body saying, right?
Yeah.
We have eye contact. Someone might say yes, but their eyes, again, are saying no. Or vice, there's people that they might be saying, like their body might be saying no, but their words might be saying maybe they want to, but something's happening in their body. So we have our verbal language, our body language, eye contact, and I would say facial expressions.
Mhm,
So to me, like all of it combined is ways that we essentially fully give consent. So someone might be really into something, they might want to start something, they might start doing it, but something might happen in their mind, in their heart, in their body, and they want to change, and someone else receptive and open to that. Healthy communication, my friends, like communicate, right? I'm not judging anyone for their sexual actions. It's more of
mhm,
like just consent. And even people can be aggressive and do all sorts of kinds of things, but they ultimately could still consent to it. Two
mhm.
adults can consent to it. So yes, that the verbal piece is a big part of this, with many people who also sadly blame themselves when they said yes and gave in, but in reality, if it was consensual, you wouldn't be talking to me for 4 years after it happened. Does that make sense?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad we brought this up, and I'm glad you talked about it because I think you're right. I think there's a lot of times where you say yes because you do finally feel pressured after many no's, and you give in. But I'm also curious though how much people use that as the perpetrator uses that as an excuse. Well, they said yes. It's always they said yes. If it's either a no or yes, and they said yes. Do they get away with essentially their actions because of this said yes, and again air quotes for those who are listening.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, it's the least reported violent crime. So most people not reporting. And then another reason why it's
Mm,
very difficult to convict is because of a lack of evidence.
mm,
So in a high school setting, in a college setting, as two examples, it can be very difficult where they said the he said, she said type thing. I mean, that is real, right? I mean, I was involved in a case where the only evidence that they had was that sex happened. There was,
mhm.
but there's no evidence per se that a rape took place.
Right.
So it's just really difficult. And in those moments, so sure, some people can easily say, "What do you mean?" She said yes, she totally wanted to, and we had sex. And someone says,
Mhm.
"No, I didn't say that." And how do you determine that in a court of law? It's really
Yeah.
difficult. And
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 in
I
my personal, go ahead.
no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, in my personal experience, I people are not seeking those convictions. They're hurting. They want to heal. They want to grow. They battle with it every day,
Mm.
and it's not about that conviction, whereas other people really want that conviction and they go throughout the whole process. And plenty of people do get that criminal conviction and other people don't. So
I've had a lot of I've had not a lot, but I've had students too who have had, unfortunately, situations happen to them, and they don't end up pursuing it too because they're afraid of the retaliation that is going to
oh yeah.
come from the
Hmm.
perpetrator, from the system, from
Hmm.
how people at either the college or university level are going to portray them or see them,
Hmm.
or they're not going to believe them. So I feel like there's a lot of people who I've either read stories of or personally know who end up not wanting to pursue any kind of action because of the fear that comes with it. Do you find that that's a frequent thing as well too? Is this fear of how you're going to perceive, or that it's actually going to bring almost a deeper level of trauma to you, because not only will you have the event, but you're going to have to constantly relive the event by having to share what happened with multiple individuals, and then you might end up essentially getting to a point where nobody either believes you, or even if they do believe you, well, what can we do about it because it's your word against theirs.
You're absolutely right. And it's not just fear of, perpetrators or the system or the school, fear of peers.
Mhm.
So a high school student who, you know, in a relationship, whatever, say the people are popular, just for an example, and this comes out and now there's a rape accusation against people they love, the ridicule that can come to that person. It's almost like you're being punished for even speaking the truth, even more so. So
Mhm.
often of the times, it's really sad, and that doesn't mean that false accusations don't exist, because I would be lying to say that they don't. But to say that they're prevalent or the majority is not true. So when people are coming forward, more often than not, they're absolutely telling the truth. And um, yeah, the fear of all of it, not being believed, not receiving that conviction, and fear of being treated horrendously, or even if they, even just some, depending on the environment, being treated so shamefully, just by having sex, for example. There are people who
Yeah.
are treated shamefully for having premarital sex, just as an example, right? So you're absolutely right, all of that. And also, it's tough because it's amazing where we put blame and where we don't put blame. So,
Yeah.
there are many schools, and I know schools get a bad reputation because they don't take care of things. I mean, most often than not, we don't know any of the details in these cases in colleges and high schools unless you are made aware of the details. But sure, there are schools that don't respond adequately, but there are many that do, and how challenging it is when, again, there's no evidence. So, for example, it's like, why is a school mainly at fault when something happened on a Saturday night? They learn all they can. They ultimately determine no findings because they're ultimately um, can't, because of what the little information they actually have. And then that sucks, right? So the kid goes away hurting, but we could still follow up with that kid. So even in a case where they're not receiving quote unquote justice, say in a high school, we as a school can still follow up with that person once a day, once a week, once every 3 months, once every 6 months, just checking in. How are you doing? How are you doing? We
Mhm.
didn't get the conviction that you were hoping for, sadly, but we can still check in with them as a person. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, that makes 100% sense, and something that I think is important too. Well, let me ask you this, since we're getting close to the end of our time. I have a couple last minute questions I wanna ask you, and the first being, you seem to be such a wealth of knowledge and such a understanding and wonderful person. And if people wanted to learn more about you, your work, how to connect with you, what would be the best way for them to go about doing so?
You could just check out my website, at robertutaro.com. You can always email me. More than happy to speak to anyone, if you want, about anything, and we can go from there.
That's fantastic. And then the last question I want to ask you before we end today, and I ask all of my guests this question, is if you could give any advice to young adults, youth who are struggling socially, emotionally, what advice would you give to them?
Stay alive, stay here on this earth, and anything you're struggling with, anything you're suffering with, can be dealt with. Nothing that you've experienced is unspeakable. And if you end up talking to someone, they don't treat you well, don't let that keep don't let that make you stay silent for another 10, 15, 20 years. Find someone else. You have many gifts, you have many opportunities, you have many blessings in this world. So stay here. We can deal with anything that you're struggling with, and you'll see where you can really go in life.
Oh, I love that. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time today, for all of your insight, for your advice. I truly appreciate you being here on the show and for opening up and sharing such detailed information about such an intense topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to all my listeners for tuning in to the Neurodiverse Teacher Podcast, and I will see you next